Please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Henry Lickers.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I can relate to you coming to Akwesasne 41 years ago now. And I can remember talking to the chief and council at that time, and they were concerned about this issue. There was an issue that had to be dealt with. And they said, what we'd like you to do is to find out everything you can on the St. Lawrence Seaway and the effects that it's having on the people of Akwesasne. And I can remember doing the research work, and here I am, my master's degree clutched tightly on my fist, and I know everything, of course, right? Just everything. And I can do this research. So I started doing research, and I went up to Ottawa to the archives. And I looked through the archives and found a document that was prepared in 1834. And in 1834, the Mohawk Nation Council of Chiefs went to the British government and said to them that their building of the Beauharnois control structures would destroy the blue stem grass meadows, would destroy the spawning grounds, would impact upon the fish species in the St. Lawrence River. And they had a whole list of things that this would do. The British government at that time had never heard of somebody coming to talk about the environment, which they didn't even have a word for it back then, but talking about why it should be saved. And I know that the chiefs that went at that point explained to the chiefs that were the British that were there why this was so. And the British said, "Oh, that was such a nice presentation. We'll pay you 80,000 pounds at that time." That would probably be worth almost $1 million nowadays. The chiefs came home and the clan mother scolded them, from what I've been able to gather. They said that you went up to talk to these people, and any reasonable people would listen to those arguments and would therefore not do it. So go back again. And they went back again. They actually went 3 times to the British and told them all of the things that was going to be impacted. The second time they went, the British said, "We'll give you 100,000 pounds." They came home, chiefs got scolded again. They went back to them and they said, we can't do this. You can't destroy the environment this way. They said, "Well, we'll give you 120,000 pounds to do this." And when they came home, our people just couldn't believe that you could actually pay money to destroy the environment. I don't know if Akwesasne ever got that funds. In the archives, it was unclear where that money went to. I think actually it was used to set up Indian Affairs, but that's just my own bias. I put the words that come before all else up before you because I think it's central to how we believe, but it's also central to the environment and to the history that we have. These words are to remind us of the environment that surrounds us and the long history that we have in the St. Lawrence River Valley. We know that our people have been here, we're sure of, 9,000 years ago. And I have a sneaking suspicion that you can push that back probably to 35,000 years ago. Maybe not right here, but, and there is even more archaeological evidence that's showing that we might have been here for about 250,000 years, or at least in North America. And if that be the case, then it means our people have an antiquity upon this land that goes far beyond just a few years that I learned when I first went to university. When I first went to university, I always used to talk to the anthropology people, and they always used to talk about Native people have never been in North America longer than 10,000 years. And at that time, there was only 5 or 6 of them, and they were running around in the bushes naked. They had no idea of what was going on. But what we do know nowadays is that in 600 AD, the city of Syracuse was still a city. It was 60,000 native people living there, Onondagas. And they were progressing really quite well. They had government, they had all of those things that made them nations and who they are. Go ahead, next one. This slide is just to show you where a little bit of Akwesasne. For you people, I hope you can see it. It's sets out from the Lake Ontario and goes straight down to the Gulf. This little map at the top there shows the bigger area. I'm using that map as the map that literally about 35,000 years ago. And why I start there is because the original slide I was going to put up was just a blank paper. Because here in Akwesasne, 35,000 years ago, there was a 3-mile deep sheet of ice. And that's on the Wisconsin glaciation. It extended well into the United States, covering all of the Great Lakes and all of this area. And that ice sheet kept anybody from moving north into this area. Next. At roughly 15,000 years ago, if you can, go back. My ice sheet's retreating too quickly. Keep going, one more back. This line right here on North America represents the ice sheet as it was retreating at about 15,000 years ago. And as the ice sheet retreated, people from the south began to move north into the area. And so what you see here is this area here actually became one enormous lake. It was an absolutely huge lake. It covered all of the Great Lakes and much of the St. Lawrence River. And the way that it drained wasn't north or east, it went south through the Mississippi and gouged out the Mississippi River Valley. And so our people that were there at that time knew that something was was happening and began to follow that river valley up. Now, where did they come from before them? My great-grandmother, when I was small, I was the sickly one in the family. I know I don't look that way now. I seem to be filled out quite well. But I had to stay home, and when I was up till I was about 12 years old. And as we used to say among the kids at the house, and I had to listen to great-grandma and grandma all day long, and I couldn't go out to play because I was so sick. It's only now that I really appreciate those stories that they told me, because my grandmother and great-grandmother told me about this time. They told me about the time when our people couldn't come up north because there was a huge sheet of ice, and that you couldn't get past that ice because it was so huge and so monstrous at the time. So there's also Akwesasne. To her, wasn't called Akwesasne, she called it another name. And what she was referring to is when the river roared. And around 9,000, whereas about 10,000 years ago, what happened is that you can see this ice sheet is beginning to retreat again, and it's moving away. But right along the St. Lawrence River, you can almost put a ruler on the St. Lawrence River, and it's straight as a die. And the reason why was this was a real major fault. And around 10,000, 15,000 years ago, that fault shifted. And remember, I told you there was a huge lake back here. Instead of draining through the Mississippi, it all drained down the St. Lawrence River. And it was enormous. And so in our legends, we talk about hearing that river roar. We look at it nowadays when they built the seaway, and at Polly's Gut, they decided that they were going to throw some rocks in there to divert the water. And so they threw rocks into the river about the size of Volkswagens. And the river just rolled them down the river. So they had to look for rocks the size of school buses in order to be able to stop the water and channel it. At this time, this water was big enough to move rocks that would be the size of this room. All of that water banked up here began to flow along that fault and ran straight as a die, like I said, down to St. Lawrence. My great-grandmother even had a story about Snai, which I've heard repeated a couple times, but she said that the channel between the mainland and Yellow Island there was where the river got a little bit lazy and turned over on its side and decided to sleep for a little bit. The problem is that when it turned over on its side, at the beginning of that channel, it's about 100 feet deep. It's a really deep channel. And that's one of those areas where the ice gouged out this huge channel leading into the marshes. So it leads and generally comes up to the marshes, and that's what makes that toe of that area so productive, because all of the silts and things that came along the river were deposited there. This had a lot to do with this time as that water stream came through there. When it cut through, remember, like I said, this huge lake that was here actually had landlocked salmon in it. And that salmon helped supply food for our people, and we used them. However, they were not related to the Atlantic salmon. And that difference between the Atlantic salmon and the Great Lakes salmon existed for literally thousands of years. So much so that when we analyzed salmon bones out of old trash sites of our people, you can take the DNA out of them and actually get markers and find out where they come from. Best way to understand a marker is almost like a road sign or your identification card, where you hold it up and the person looks at it and says, oh yeah, Akwesasne. Well, salmon have that in their DNA and in their bones. And so you can tell the salmon that was in the Great Lakes and the salmon that was in the Atlantic Ocean. And here in Akwesasne, we were fortunate. We had a blend of the two. And so we could use both of those sites. The other thing that was happening at this time is that when that broke, the ice sheet that had extended back quite a bit south moved north. Because it was isolated, that small little piece, it melted really quickly. And so what happened is that you have this ice sheet moving quite a bit north. At that time, I have a legend that probably you all know, is that when it retreated like that, what happened was that, again, this whole area was covered by like a bog. If you go way far north now to the peat areas up north, you'll see that the area is really flat, has very little trees growing on it, but it produces 100 million mosquitoes and black flies. And in our legends, of course, everybody knows the legend about the giant mosquitoes. And I can just see our men about 10,000, 15,000 years ago, and our women are saying, well, go find us some more land. We need some more land. So they're coming from the south down in here, and they're coming up this way, and suddenly they run into this area where there's 1 billion mosquitoes. And they don't want to stay there. I can understand that immensely. But they can't really go back to their women and say, oh, the mosquitoes beat us back, you know, we're tough, we're strong. And so they went back, and I can hear them telling the story. Oh, we got up there, and there were these 7-foot mosquitoes. And boy, I tell you, we fought them and we fought them, but they beat us back. And the women, of course, looked at them and went, yeah, right, okay. But again, in my way of my great-grandmother, as she told me this story, she said, well, they went back 3 times. 3 times they tried to come up into this area, and 3 times they were driven back. What's interesting about that story, too, is that as they came up into this area, they saw a unique formation here that sits right at Gananoque, right at Kingston. And what my great-grandmother called that was She said that that was the bones of the mother. And how she knew what it looked like, I don't know to this day. But she said that if you look down at Tug Hill, which is down in this area, it looks like a woman's head laying on the ground, sort of resting. And where it crosses the St. Lawrence River at Gananoque there, you see all of the stones that are different. They're actually Precambrian shield that actually comes right up to the surface. It extends north and expands out to make half of Canada. And what she said was that was the Mother Earth laying on the ground, and you could see her backbone as it went up into the Great Lakes. I haven't been able to ever to find anybody else that had that same story. And don't worry, I've looked all over the place for it. But again, these are some of the things that she talked to me about. As that water receded, and like I said, these big mosquitoes were here. Our men went up 3 times, and of course the story goes that finally, after battling them and hitting with the war clubs, they broke up into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces until finally we chased them back into the cedars, and we were victorious. And we then moved up into this area, which still was pretty rough at that time. My Anishinaabe friends always say to me that when I go with them as a Haudenosaunee, they'll say, yeah, Henry, you go down the pathway first. Why? Well, go down the pathway first. You're okay. We're going to go down that way to the lake. So I walk in front of them, and finally I said to him, why are you sending me first? He said, the mosquitoes are still at war with you. They'll leave us alone. And sure enough, as soon as I walk by the cedar bushes, they come out like in droves to eat me. So again, I can see that battle still going on. It must have been a really amazing place because our people have quite a few legends at it about this time. And what I found is that by looking at our legends and analyzing them from what I know about the geology and the history of our area, the old histories of our area, I found many other examples of this time. So it tells me that around 12 to 15,000 years ago, our people had started to come up in this area. Do I know that there were Mohawks? Do I know that there were Haudenosaunee? What I find is that the archaeological evidence that you got start talking about a St. Lawrence River Mohawk people. And I don't know what the difference between a St. Lawrence River Mohawk person is and a Mohawk person is, but they seem to think it's important. But our people were moving into this area. The other story that I like to relate at this time, which goes into more and more science than you can imagine, is the story about the flying head. That fiery head that would follow you across the tundra or across the area here. And that if it touched you, it incinerated you. Or what they would say, my grandmother would say, it consumed you. And she had many stories about that. As a kid, I listened to those and I went, oh yeah, that's a nice story. We did good things. We got across the river. Dogs helped save us. And, world went on. As a scientist, I look at these things and I try to figure out what was happening at that time. What's very interesting about this is around that time, you see this ice sheet had gone even farther north. But it was so big and so heavy that it actually pushed the earth down. And when it pushed the earth down, in what they call a crystalline structure, it added energy to the earth. So as the ice melted, it rebounded. It started to come up. It's still coming up today at about a centimeter every 100 years now. But back then, it was enormous. And what does this have to do with the flying head? Well, there's a little thing, and it's called, I don't expect anybody to remember this, but it's called the Pizarro effect. And it says that if you ever put pressure on the crystal and then release it suddenly, the crystal will try to go back to its original shape and it will form a spark. Now, every one of you here, I'm sure, knows this. And how would you know that? Because at one time you had a lighter. And that lighter, when you pressed the button, made a spark. The little crystal that was inside that lighter was what you were pushing on. When it clicked, it released the little thing that was putting pressure on the crystal, and in doing so created a spark. So what happened here is you have a giant lighter. It's a huge one, thousands of miles across. And as that land is coming up, it's releasing energy into the air. Remember, like I said, this was more like tundra. Up north, not many trees, lots of marshes, lots of water. And what happened was, when those sparks were let off, they would travel across the surface. Sometimes they would be called ball lightning, but back then they were much bigger. And because there wasn't anything really tall, it really had nothing to touch onto. So when we walked onto the land and walked across, we're one of the best conductors of electricity that you got. Suddenly this big ball of lightning, whoa, would come right down on us, and we'd, oh man, flee. And I can see our people meeting those big, huge balls of electricity or lightning or flames, and if it touched you, it literally would incinerate you. And so the story that I heard about this describes the landscape that the hunter was going over, describes that at that point, 15,000 years ago, that our people had already started to domesticate dogs, and that they were now part of our people, and that they knew that if they could get across the river, the head couldn't follow them. And why couldn't it follow them? Well, water is a really good conductor of electricity. As soon as you would cross a large body of water, it would discharge into the river, not into the person. And so our stories, because of the detail that our grandmothers and grandfathers have in their minds about those stories, also give us a glimpse of what it looked like in this time in the past. So the St. Lawrence River Valley is an amazing place. Geologically, you fell asleep? Oh, you're I'm just going to stop telling stories then. I was just going to say, when that ice sheet receded quite a ways, 9,000 years ago, like I said, what happened is that the salmon people who were living and the sea people who were living on the East Coast saw the ice sheet disappearing, and they said, wow, look at this nice big river we have here. We should follow that river and see what's up there. There's salmon, there's all of these different creatures in there, and there's deer and moose. There were buffalo here, woodland buffalo, and caribou, woodland caribou. All of these creatures lived in this area, and they saw it as a really rich place. And so they decided that they would start coming up the St. Lawrence River. From the north and the south side of that ice sheet, which was out west, where the Cree peoples, Navajo peoples, they lived, they saw that opening up as well, and this huge lake that had been there now had been separated out into the smaller lakes. And so they said, wow, this looks like an interesting place. We're going to go there too. And so they started to come together. From the south, more and more of our people moved north to the St. Lawrence. So if we talk about St. Regis being there at 1600, I got a feeling that way back about 9,000 years ago, our people were still here. And we continued to occupy the St. Lawrence River Valley. And so they met roughly in the center. Actually, wasn't Montreal. It was probably up here. And at that time, the only real thing that we would fight over would be resources. But because the area was so plentiful, I can just see a Mi'kmaq guy coming here and going, I want that salmon. And the Mohawk guy going, yeah, take that one. There are 47 billion others. There's enough for all of us. And so the Anishinaabe, for example, and the Cree have stories about them coming to this area and being welcomed by the people that were here. We didn't fight them. we actually invited them into the area. This area, again, can we go back just one? This area, again, becomes really very important. And the Thousand Islands there, which is the Thousand Islands National Park, is unique because it has something like today, 21 different ecosystems that exist in that area. And it became sacred not only to our people, but to all of the people who lived in the area. Why? Because the medicine people could go there, collect good, clean medicines from the back of that Mother Earth, and they could use that for ceremony and in the things that they needed to cure their people. And so when you look at the Thousand Islands and the park that's there, they haven't been able to find any sign of settlement of any people living on that land. And somebody would say, well, did nobody live there? Well, yes they did. Because all around the Thousand Islands area, in an area that's encompasses like that on both sides of the river, you can see that they left the Thousand Islands to themselves, but camped around the outside. So you can see a medicine person would go to that area, would camp, set up their camp, do their purification, do the things that they have to do, go in and collect their medicines, bring them out of the area, prepare them, take them back. So this area of the St. Lawrence River was like our pharmacy. And you wouldn't go into that area and desecrate it because you want your medicines to be good. And everyone, all of those people who came into this area at that time, like I said, 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, knew about that area and set it aside as sacred among our people. So what's interesting to me is that in the 1800s, 1700s, the Mohawks, the Onondagas, are, they're concerned because there are settlers who are moving onto the islands in the Thousand Islands. And our people are concerned, the local colonial people that were there were concerned because they said, these people are just squatting on those islands. We can't have that. And so the first Canadian Park Reserve was set up because the Mohawks and the Onondagas and the settlers didn't want them settling on those islands and wanted them off there. Banff usually says that they're the first national park in Canada. They weren't. This is the first. And it was set up because Native people and the local people wanted it preserved and kept. Today, we still can go there. Our medicine people are welcomed by the park, and that we can go in and pick there using the traditions of our people that we normally do. The Anishinaabe, like I said, and the Cree that came down here, we had friendship belts with them that expressed this friendship between us and that we would continue to do so. Remember, I'm still 5,000 years ago. I told my grandmother, I said, but I hear all these stories about us fighting and all these stories about how she said, that didn't start until maybe 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago when these white people came in and started stirring up trouble between us because of furs. But at that time, I said to her, you mean to say we never had any battles back then? Oh yeah. But we didn't battle over resources or that. She said the only thing that men at that time would fight over was women. So I guess nothing really changes even to today. The area, like I said, the area is, again, geologically really unique. Remember, I was talking about the rebounding of the Earth after that big ice sheet melted. Well, it's also really important too, and people in Snai know this because when we drilled, or when the wells were drilled for the casino, they got a big, huge salt plume. And the reason for that is that right here about St. Regis Road, if you go across the river, you have to go down maybe 10, 15, 20 feet to hit bedrock. On St. Regis Road, you only have to go down maybe a foot or so. It's the reason why the quarry is there. And if this is what they call a geosyncline, don't have to remember that word, but it just means a big bowl. And that big bowl extends right out this way, right out to almost to the Atlantic Ocean. That bowl is important because before glaciation, there was a huge lake here, way back. Now I'm going back a million years, and I don't want to go back there too much. But this established all of the limestone rock that was there. And that has importance today. So for example, when we were digging the pipe under the seaway during the building of the low-level bridge for the gas line there, when we tried to put in this area, put that gas line under, we had to go down 25 meters below the bottom of the St. Lawrence River. Any shallower, and we were into a dolomite, which is a rock that forms on the top of this big bowl. And I always like the term, it's vuggy dolomite. And vuggy dolomite, all it means is it looks like Swiss cheese. Just has hundreds of holes in it. And you can't put a pipeline through there because if you did, it would break out and it would come up into the St. Lawrence. So they had to go down another 20 meters to get below that level. These big bowls also trap seawater. And so when the ocean, when you noticed in some of those first maps, this area here was actually the Atlantic Ocean came in, and the ocean was on top of the land. And it formed, and when the land sank and came back up again, it trapped seawater really deep into the bedrock. It's the reason why in this area, we suggest you don't go down below 200 feet, because if you hit that old seabed, seawater, it comes springing up out of the ground, which is what happened. The other thing that's interesting about these dolomites, it didn't form on this side, is that there's another small one here between Akwesasne and the Thousand Islands. So as you're driving along 401, you'll notice that bedrock in this area is pretty thick. You got good soils. But as you get down towards Gananoque, suddenly you see that red rock, black rocks coming to the surface. And they'll be right on the surface. And then as you go, and just before Kingston, that rock disappears and the limestone is back again. And the reason why is there's a small bowl here. So maybe one dish, one spoon. I don't know, maybe that's where they got it from. But our people knew about these bowls that were here and their importance because of the minerals that were there. So this syncline here, or this big bowl, actually goes all the way down to Six Nations. And it's one of the reasons that at Six Nations, you had gas and oil wells. Why? Because at Six Nations and in that area, it trapped huge areas of that old ocean, and all of the animals that died and went to the bottom were trapped there, which then later became gas and oil. And so these synclines are really quite important to the geology of the area and to how we look on it. The other thing that I'm worrying about is this syncline here is much the same as the syncline for Six Nations. And I'm worried because one of the things that they're down in upstate New York that has that same type of dolomite is they want to hydrofrack it. That's where they go and see if they can get gas and oil out of it. And hydrofracking in this area would be absolutely deadly to the river. And so I think we have to be ever vigilant, as they say, to anyone who wants to do that in the area. So we lived in relative peace, like I said, up until about 1,000 years ago. And the next map I'm going to show you is a blurry one, but this is the growing or plant tolerance maps. And for the Department of the Environment, this is a really important map. And the reason why is that if you look at Six Nations, Paradise here, you know, that's where I come from, you'll notice that it's in the yellow band, and that yellow band extends right along and comes right around again up here. Akwesasne, or heaven, is here. And what you have is that yellow band is a whole zone of really warm type weather. It's called the Carolinian type strip. So the reason that Six Nations can grow the vegetables and things that they can is because they have that perfect weather condition for it. But a better analysis of this area, which we've done, shows us that this yellow band actually proceeds up here as well. And so what it means is that Akwesasne is one of the few areas in Canada where you can find endangered species that you would only find in the Carolinian forest at Six Nations in Canada. When I first came here 40 years ago, one of my favorite butterflies at Six Nations was Carna blue. It's a big blue butterfly, about that big, and it's gorgeous. When you see it, your heart just stops. It's just so lovely to see. And when I first arrived here, I remember I was in the snipe area of the community, walking through one of the paddocks down there, and suddenly there was this big Carna blue. When I was so excited, I went back and looked through all my research and everything that I had. I couldn't find that butterfly had ever been identified in this area. And I thought, geez, all you had to go is look for it. What I found later is that biologists and scientists haven't studied this area. And when I asked some of my friends why, they said, well, we don't go there. There be Mohawks there. It's a terrible place. They'll eat you if you go down there, you know. And so what happened is that this whole area around Akwesasne hasn't been studied. And as we've done our work, both the American side and the Canadian side, looking for those endangered species, what's happened is we found whole bunches of 40, 50 of them. Every kind of turtle except the western painted turtle is here. You know, and our people know that they're here. And so when you ask them, they tell you about them. That's another whole set of stories, because every one of those turtles have a story about them and why they're there. And of course, all turtles are the most handsome, intelligent, and modest too. I just happen to be Turtle Clan as well. So that's a little bit of the geology and history here of the animals that were here. I'm going to go into the more boring stuff now, but again, our people have existed in this area. Thompson Island and some of the islands we know we have archaeological evidence that shows that we were back, again, 9,000 years here. Interesting to me is that we're talking about those species at risk. We have a thing called the eastern box turtle, which many of you will know. It was a turtle that was used in ceremony by our women to do water ceremony. The box turtles were kept in order that our people could do that. When the species at risk scientists sat down to determine whether box turtle was here, they said, no, it was never here. And I said, well, how then do you find it in those trash heaps that our people had from our villages that were back then? They didn't just fly there, you know. They had to be there. Somebody had to bring them. And so what they did, they still won't allow it to be classified as a Canadian species or an Ontario species. But I'm still fighting with them about this and still supplying information. And maybe in another 5 or 6 years, we might be able to get box turtle on the list. But these are some of the acts that the Department of the Environment program works with. And what's interesting to me is, remember I'm talking 10,000, 9,000 years ago, are people here living on the land? It's only since 1982 and forward that we've actually been recognized as having rights to the resources and to the land itself and to hunt here. Before that, we were looked on as poachers. We were looked on as people who were decimating the environment around us. And yet it was us that was protecting that environment. All of these acts that you see here are different pieces. We had to win every step of the way in order to be recognized by the Canadian government. I like the Adams case right here in the center. That was an interesting case because what it did is that Adams was fishing just off what the Canadian government considered federal Indian reserve lands, and so therefore not fishing in his territory. Game wardens caught him, took him to court. I had the privilege of testifying at that, talking much about the way that I've been talking here. The judge listened to us, and he agreed with us. He said that Mr. Adams was fishing within his territory, and his territory extended far beyond the bounds that the federal government had established as the St. Regis Indian Reservation. It extended far beyond that. And the history that I just went through was the same type of history that I went through with them. And the judge said that that was a very good presentation. Although the Canadian government tried to discredit me at every time they said, well, how can you talk about it? You're not a historian. I said, no, I'm not a historian. I can talk about it though, because I'm a biologist too. And so I know the biology of the area and I know what's here. And I'm glad to say that the judge agreed with me and with our people. And so those now have become the way in which we work. Interesting, the last application of this was the low-level bridge. In the past, Enbridge ran a pipeline on the high-level bridge, never paid nothing. Why? It's the Seaways land. I can run through there anytime I want to, and we can make an agreement with them. A Soyuz says that you have never relinquished the right to the land, the rights to that land, even if you have agreements or it's being expropriated. So this Soyuz says to Enbridge and to the Seaway, you cannot make an agreement between the two of you that exclude the Mohawks because you're in their territorial lands and they have rights to it. And that's the reason why that Enbridge had to go into negotiations with us. Now, even though we've won these things, that still doesn't give you any money to do any of the environmental stuff. But they said, well, since you win all these things, we're going to take something away. And so all of these acts come in. And each one of these, the Indian Act, the only environmental things it talks about are forests and mining. So Indian Affairs wants to know if you're cutting a tree down or mining sand or doing anything like that. And we at the environment try to help you with those type of things by doing assessments. EPA, or the Environmental Protection Act, again mentions Native people. It's sort of saying, you guys better take care of the environment. We've only done it for couple thousand years, but they're now saying that it's important. The Environmental Assessment Act says that when you do a project within our reserve, within our community, you have to have an environmental assessment on it. And I think that's just good sense. The department or the program, we can help you build a better project by showing you the things that can be done in order that that project be safe. Species at Risk Act is a good one because it specifically mentions Native people in it and has a big place for us. Why is it important to Akwesasne? Well, myself and Bob Stevenson actually helped write that act along with all of the other 7 major organizations, Native organizations in Canada, and made sure that they included Native people in there, because the information we were getting from our people was that we wanted to make sure these species were protected. Our own wildlife conservation law reflects that. The Navigable Waters Act, which is the St. Lawrence River, that's a Dr. and Jekyll Hyde type of thing. At one hand it says, the St. Lawrence River is a natural water system. And on the other hand, you say, no, it's got dams all over it. It's not a natural water system. So you're liable for all of that damage. They go, no, it's a natural water system. Until you go out there and start fishing, and then they go, this is a navigable water. I don't understand law. Maybe that's why I went into biology. Source Water Protection Act, Drinking Water Act, you can see them all there. They're all different acts. Under the Hazardous Product Act, when the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne passed a resolution that said no nuclear waste can cross the environment or can cross our community, that act says that yes, we can do that. So the government's sort of always wanting to tell us when we can do stuff, even when we do it anyways. I just put a little bit of propaganda in here. This is again, in the beginning, the Department of the Environment started in 1976, and it was to deal with issues in Akwesasne on using science and traditional or local knowledge to see how those issues were impacting on us. And in 2010, we merged economic development, emergency measures, and the arena together into one department in order that we could all work together. And you can imagine how important it is for our people to work together. If you're setting up a gas station, you're setting up, some type of project, you want to be able to say that, yes, we're protecting the environment, and that we can help you with that. In 1976, the major issues, like I said, was the seaway. When I came back from archives, what happened was that I looked at archives and looked at all that information, had written it all down, and I compared it with the report that I had written to council on the seaway, and said, I wonder how they got my report back in 1867. I just couldn't understand that. And I realized at that time that our people here have a really deep history of that river. The fluoride contamination we were working on, we're still working on that. And what's happening now is that more and more of the science is showing that even fluoridation of drinking water is not the way to go. Many countries in Europe and Asia now no longer fluoridate their cities. Mercury, Myrex, PCBs, I hate to say it, but that list goes on for 135 other contaminants that we can find in the river. We did the first health study here on human health, the Selikoff study, and looked at how human health was impacting on our people, and helped coordinate working with Dr. David Carpenter for the last 40 years on human health here. And his findings have shown that there is no safe level in fish for those other organics like PCBs in fish in the St. Lawrence River. That even at the lowest level that they've got, they can still find effect. We also took Reynolds and Alcoa to court. That was the beginning things. That was a horrendous time. We were using funds and things from the Mohawk Council to try and protect the people here. And Indian Affairs was telling us that we were irresponsible. And so at one point, they literally were going to shut the doors because we had spent the money in order to try to go after those Reynolds and Alcoa. In the end, we had to settle, and it was probably the most sad time in my life, as we had to tell the farmers that we had been working with that we were settling that case. But again, the lawyers were the ones that walked away with half of the funds, but we were able to get some funding to the farmers themselves. We are also one of the first federally recognized Indian reserves in Canada that actually had a conservation department, actually put people on the river. In 1976, we deputized people to go out on the river for our rights to the water. And so what we say is that the environment program assumes the authority over the lands, the waters of Akwesasne, including the islands, waters, weed beds, water beds, mainland that are under the jurisdiction of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. And this is a large, extensive area, probably much, much bigger than many people believe. And that over the environmental laws and policy of the Mohawk Council that apply to, in this area, apply to all people within our territory. Not just Mohawk people, but anyone who comes into the territory, so non-natives as well. And that was one of the first things that we thought we were going to have a lot of trouble with. But as we've worked with Natural Resources and Ministry of the Environment and with Environment Canada and all of these people, what they're saying to us is the laws that we're bringing forward are as good as or better than theirs. And if that be the case, our laws supersede theirs. We've got to get the US side to start thinking that way too, but in Canada they began. So just some of the aims of is to protect and enhance the natural environment of the community of Akwesasne, to act as an information, research, and remedial facility to improve the environment, to better inform the Mohawk Council community of Akwesasne concerning environmental issues, and to supply expertise to other native and non-native communities which may need our support. And so we've helped a lot of different people. The St. Lawrence River Institute we established, the Eastern Ontario Model Forest we established and have been on those boards since they began. And now our neighbors are beginning to believe that the environment is important to us. I have another 25 million slides, but I don't have to go. This is just a little bit about the forestry program we have. We also have a species at risk program that's looking at minnows and things in our environment. The reason we're looking at minnows is because, again, in our philosophy, we say that if you want to see where the biggest impact is, look at the smallest things. And so when we look at the minnows, we're beginning to see those populations decline. And as a result of that, we're worried about things like muskellunge, the bigger predator species, because if they disappear, what will happen is those will disappear as well. We have an environmental education program that runs Thompson Island. I don't know if many of you have been out there, but sometimes you should go out. Just phone the department if you want to go and see it. Bob and his people are out there. Wayland is the person who's overseeing it now. I think Bob is sort of retired, but I got a feeling that he's going to be around to bug us a long time. He's the Métis Association of Canada of Akwesasne, I think. We also have an environmental assessment program, and what that does is it works on all programs, all projects that we have within the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, and any of the programs that are funded through economic development. And when the new law is written, the amendments to the new conservation law, what will happen is that all projects will be included in that. And what we do is we, not like the federal government that comes down and tries to pound you on the head for not doing something, what we want to do is work with you. So if a person has a project that they want to build in Akwesasne, the Department of the Mohawk, the Environment Program, wants to work with you in order to do a better job at it. I put that slide in and that color so you'd all wake up when you see it. But these are just a lot of the other issues that we're dealing with, and source water, drinking water, St. Lawrence River Institute, St. Lawrence River Restoration Council. We're on the standing committees, for example, for endangered species. We work with the National Aboriginal Species at Risk Council, Iroquois Caucus, Nation Building, State of the Lakes Conference, we're at them all the time, Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force. which Dave will talk about. Indigenous cooperative in the environment. Again, we work with a lot of other First Nation communities, and they're always asking us for our advice on how to run their own departments. The chief is a busy person. Saw him around, some people around here. He's also one of the directors of the St. Lawrence River Institute, expected to be there. Member of the environmental assessment team, which we discussed with them. Participates in the Eastern Ontario Model Forest. Member of the St. Lawrence River Restoration Council. Represents the environment program on the Hill and in federal, provincial government as well. Next. So that's what I've got to talk about. Could go on for another 3 hours, but I think I'll let you rest now and let somebody else speak. Thank you.